Hi students, making some dinner here, and I've got this lovely bunch of radishes that I would like to, wash, quite dirty, and rinse. Let's get to it. Radishes are a root vegetable, so they tend to have quite a bit of dirt and other nasty stuff on them. Now I'm on my third rinse, and man, these guys keep seeming to slip away from me when I try to get rid of the water here. I wonder what I could use instead. This little colander is going to make my life way easier. Let's do it. Aren't colanders the best? Just radishes inside, all the water out. And this idea of some sort of substance or object that can keep some things from passing through, but let other stuff go right through, that's the concept we're going to talk about today. It's called permeability. I'm going to go on over to page 17, or the next blank page in my notebook. I'm going to leave the title blank for now, but I will divide the page down the middle, our regular old note-taking style. And I'm going to leave myself maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 lines before we start off with permeability. Permeability is the ability of a substance to allow other substances to pass through. Often they're talking about a membrane. And there are 3 types of permeability. We can have a thing that is completely permeable, meaning all substances pass through. Something that is impermeable, meaning that no substances pass through. And finally, something that is semi-permeable, meaning only some or certain substances pass through. Cool breezes. But I can't get through, just the air. Quarantine life. Can you name any other things that are impermeable, don't allow anything through? Permeable, allow everything through? Or semi-permeable, only allow some molecules through? Try. So you may be wondering, Ms. Lim, why are we talking about permeability and impermeability and all of that stuff? Have you made the connection yet to one of our cell organelles that we were talking about last week? Specifically, the cell membrane. And that is because the cell membrane is used, yes, for protection, very much like a wall or a border, but it is also controlling transport of molecules in and out of the cell. So he's going to allow some molecules in, and then others he is not going to allow in, depending on what the cell needs. This week and next week is all about the cell membrane and transportation across the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a membrane that surrounds and protects the cytoplasm and the organelles in the cell. It is also used mainly for protection and also to monitor the transport of molecules in and out of the cell. If you want to, you can then think about the cell membrane as being something like the wall of a house. Provides protection, but it also controls what can actually go in and what can't go out. It's also a little bit like a border guard at the door, deciding, do you come in, molecule? Or am I going to keep you out? Now, just like with any wall, in order to find out what actually is allowed in and what is kept out, I need to figure out, like, what are the building blocks? What is the wall actually made out of? Building blocks. We're going back to macromolecules, y'all. If you're able to, go ahead and go onto the hub and find and print out this diagram of a close-up of the cell membrane. If you're not able to, we're going to draw it in your notebook, and I'll kind of show you a more simplified way of how to do that. So if I'm drawing, I want to go ahead and go on over to page 18. And the best way to draw the cell membrane close-up would be just to draw a bunch of little circles. And each of those circles are going to have a couple lines, like legs. And then you're going to have a bottom layer of circles. And each of those have two lines, like legs. I'm going to have some gaps in my wall where larger molecules come through, as if they were tunnels or passageways. And then the regular building blocks of the wall will continue, some circles with a couple lines as legs. Now, as we are creating this, you'll notice that one, the cell membrane is not uniform. There's a lot of different molecules involved. And two, it's mostly composed of these circles with two little lines as legs. Do you remember at all from biomolecules what these types of molecule this is, what this type of molecule is? If you said phospholipid, give yourself a gold star. Let's draw ourselves a nice little simplified diagram of a phospholipid up in the top right-hand corner. And if you're using this diagram, you can just draw it up here. Remember, those long lines stand for your fatty acids. In this case, we're going to call them fatty acid tails. And this circle stands for what we call his phosphate head. And altogether, this guy is going to make up a phospholipid. Now, if you're looking at the cell diagram that you either drew or printed, you might notice that we've got two layers of phospholipids. We've got one up here with the heads pointing outwards and a second down here with the heads pointing downwards, right? And that is why the cell membrane is sometimes referred to as the phospholipid bilayer. I have three distinct names for the cell membrane, so let's start recording that here. The first name that we gave it was the phospholipid bilayer. Bi meaning two. So two layers of phospholipids. And that's because it has the very distinct heads on the outside, tails on the inside. There's one layer of phospholipids. And then heads on the outside, tails on the inside, two layers of phospholipids. One and since the cell membrane is made up mostly of phospholipids, this means we should really study the chemical composition of a phospholipid to find out more about this membrane. After all, there are the building blocks. If I look at it, the phosphate head is going to be charged. In fact, it's going to have a kind of negative charge, right? Whereas the tails have no charge. They are neutral. Remember, long chains of hydrocarbons, they have a neutral charge. And what that ends up doing is that the head is something that I'm going to call either polar or hydrophilic. And the tails are going to be something that I'm going to call nonpolar or hydrophobic. Hydro means water, philic means lover, or love. So the head of a phosphate actually loves water, and it also loves all negatively charged, positively charged, and polar things.
My water, oh my water, I love my water, it's so hydrophilic.
On the other hand, the tails, which are nonpolar, once again hydrophobic, that means that they actually have a fear or a phobia of water. They are not attracted to water. They tend to repel charged or polar molecules. Get that thing away from me. I'm so hydrophobic. So we now kind of have this polar molecule and the fact that the head behaves one way, being hydrophilic, loving water and charged molecules, and the tails behave a different way, repelling the water, repelling the charged molecules, and not interacting with them chemically. And this starts to play out because, as you can see, all of the heads are on the outside of the membrane, whereas all the tails are on the inside of the membrane. So we can say that these heads here are going to be polar or hydrophilic. And the inside portion of the membrane that has all of those phospholipid tails, that's going to be very much nonpolar. And it's going to be hydrophobic. And feel free to label this whichever way actually makes sense, that you can actually read. Hydrophobic. Okay? Just color coding here, right? And then the other set of tails down here, that's going to become, or the other set of heads down here, that's going to also be polar or hydrophobic. Hydrophilic. My goodness, I'm going to say this all one more time for you. So, my heads are on the outside of the cell membrane. They are going to be polar and hydrophilic. My tails are going to be the inside of the cell membrane. They're going to be nonpolar and hydrophobic. What does this mean for the cell membrane and how it works? You know what? I should have had you guys do this beforehand. Let's go ahead and label, let's say that this is the outside of the cell. Let's say that this is inside the cell. And then of course we've got our cell membrane separating the two. Let's say that we have some sort of charged molecule coming through. It's either positively or negatively charged, yeah? What he's going to do is, as he approaches the cell membrane, he's going to be like, yippee, I'm with other polar hydrophilic things. I feel so accepted and loved. And then as he gets to the middle of the membrane, boom, he comes into contact with the nonpolar tails, the ones that want to reject him. So this guy is actually going to have a lot of trouble crossing the cell membrane, and he's going to be repelled from the cell membrane. In fact, charged molecules are impermeable. The cell membrane is impermeable to charged molecules. And this could be things like ions such as Na+, Cl-, anything with a charge. On the other hand, if I have some sort of neutral, nonpolar molecule, something like oxygen, no charge, even water, slightly charged, but not that bad. Hydrogen, those all have no charge, very neutral. They're going to come on up to the cell membrane. They're going to encounter a little bit of repulsion from these heads in here. But the heads are such a small part of the layer that once they will be able to pass through, they can go straight through the nonpolar area and get into the cell. So in fact, the cell is permeable to neutral or nonpolar. And interestingly enough, this can also include things like steroids. Remember, those are one of our lipids. Lipids in general are going to be able to pass right through the membrane because they are very, very nonpolar. They like their fellow phospholipids. We've got one more type of molecule to think about, and that is things that are large. So like our glucose molecule, for example, that was like that beautiful ring, that's large and that's charged. If this glucose molecule tries to get into the cell, he's going to be repelled right away because these phospholipids are so packed together. He's also really charged. There's just no way that he can get in. So unfortunately, large molecules also really struggle to get into the cell membrane. But then you got to ask yourself, don't I need things like sodium and chlorine and calcium, and don't I really need glucose in order to make energy? Like, I need to get these things into the cell.
Sugar, I must have my sugar.
How do you do it? Well, that's where these handy dandy blobs come into play. They act very much like tunnels or passageways that allow you to get through the otherwise dense and impermeable cell membrane. And these guys are made out of proteins. So I can have things called protein channels. And that will allow charged molecules to go through. I sometimes have things called protein pumps that maybe need a little bit of extra energy to pump molecules across. But these also are going to allow charged molecules or larger molecules to pass through. Now for just a couple more things, you might have noticed that there's a lot of little circular looking guys kind of chilling inside of the membrane here. And these are going to be what I call cholesterol. Cholesterol is a type of lipid, and it is used to help maintain the fluidity and rigidity of the cell membrane. Basically, you can think about if all the phospholipids are packed really tightly together into a dense layer, they're not going to be very flexible. But if I throw some extra molecules into the mix, I suddenly have a little bit more movement and a little bit more room overall between my phospholipids. And that's the role of cholesterol. Now, of course, if you get too much bad cholesterol, it'll actually lock up the phospholipids. But you do want a little bit of good cholesterol to keep everything moving. And then, of course, you guys have noticed sticking out of the top of the cell membrane, looking a little bit like antlers or antenna, are these rings and rings and rings and rings and rings of carbon. Yeah. And when we think carbon rings, we should definitely be thinking carbohydrates. If you notice, they're only on the outside of the cell. What these guys do is they are signaling carbohydrates. And they look like antennas and they act like antennas. The signaling carbohydrates will bind to special signaling molecules and then transmit that signal from the molecule into the cell to get the reaction that is needed. That's it for our cell membrane, and as you see, it's probably a little bit more complicated than you initially thought. It's not just a wall, it actually has very specific parts with specific functions that allow it to allow only certain things in, right? It's permeable to neutral or nonpolar things. It's impermeable to anything with a charge or anything too large. Instead, it's going to use proteins to help get those through the cell membrane and into or out of the cell. Because of this, we can classify the cell membrane as being semi-permeable, since it only allows certain things in. And we can also call it the plasma membrane. Now, why on earth would you call it a plasma membrane? Remember that the cell membrane is mostly made out of phospholipids, and lipids are things like oils and fats. So in reality, cell membranes are actually very fluid, just like oil. Very interesting. Because of this property of phospholipids being very fluid, we're going to refer to it as a plasma membrane, because plasma often in the biological sciences means something that is liquidy in nature. And that is the fluid, because phospholipids, mosaic model. A mosaic is like a piece of artwork that's composed of many smaller pieces put together. And if I were really to take a look at my cell membrane, I would notice it is very much like a mosaic, right? I've got phospholipids, proteins, carbohydrates, I've got cholesterol, I've got a lot of different small parts that are all working together to make a beautiful, functional, semi-permeable membrane. So our last name, the fluid, because remember lipids are very fluid, mosaic, meaning it's composed of many parts, model. All right, that is it from me. So make sure that you have your notes on page 17 about permeability and the names for the cell membrane. Make sure that you have your beautifully annotated fluid mosaic semi-permeable model on page 18. If you drew it, it should already be there. If you printed it out, you're gonna wanna glue this in on page 18, trim it up a bit so it actually fits. And that is it for me today. You do not have homework. You just needed to make sure your notes are updated and that you completed this ed puzzle with all those extra questions. Don't be hydrophobic. Drink the water. It is good for you, even if you are afraid of it. And I will see you guys in class.